Welcome to the podcast, Scattered, One Person's Search for the Story Behind Human Remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I explore topics related to dead people, from searching for human remains in forensic contexts to mortuary practices in modern and archaeological contexts, and everything in between. I offer information, perspectives, and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who work with remains. All of this aims to provide you with information on subjects that aren't really talked about, don't seem to be a priority, or they can be very misunderstood. I hope you enjoy.
Okay, I'm Dr. Janne Holmgren. I'm a full professor at Mount Royal University in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies. I've been at MRU for 23 years.
Wow, you're one of the old folks here.
I know, scary. Not still so old.
You've seen it evolve, the institution evolve from its college days to its now university days.
Yeah, and our diploma program to the applied program to the bachelor's program. Yeah, so I've kind of been around the block.
Right, and so you came to my attention mostly because I just did a podcast episode with Alisa and Taylor, who went through, I guess, at least 1 year classes, but the medical examiner's internship that you coordinate so that they could get a practicum and do some work and get some exposure with what goes on at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. So that's kind of how you came to my attention. And but you do way much more than that. So can you kind of give a sort of how did you come to be at Mount Royal and doing your research? The research that you're currently, if you're doing any research now, what kind of brought you to that point? So kind of give us a sketch of your journey up to now.
Well, I became very interested in DNA evidence around the OJ Simpson trial, where, it was clear to me that, DNA was going to become a big part, of that. And at that time, there's really nobody in Canada that was doing critical analysis examination of the evidence. So I was really interested in the impact on trials where you have something like so novel like DNA that people can't really see, they can't really understand, how that is or how that ends up, playing out within the courtroom. So I focused my master's degree on that kind of work, whereby I interviewed defense lawyers throughout Canada. And I asked a question, like, what are the implications for your trials? Like, what are you going to do with this? How are you going to play with this? And it became really clear to me that the system that we had in place in Canada, because we don't really have independent laboratories, that the access to, for example, a retest of biological samples were really hard to get hold of. So we had, a few cases in Canada where, like think back to the Guy Palmerain case, where the defense, wanted to retest the sample, but to retest the sample in Canada, they would have had to go through the Centre of Forensic Sciences in Ontario or, through the RCMP. And they didn't want to do that, because the samples had already been examined, in the laboratory in Canada. So they had to go down to the U.S., I think it was Boston, to get the sample, reevaluated. And it became clear that it was not his DNA, that was, part of that sample. So that's a long story. And we know now that, it was a completely different individual, that was responsible for the death of 9-year-old Christine Jessup. I think it was in 1994. So the playing field within the criminal justice system is really clear to me that it was not balanced. The scales of justice was really, tilted. In addition to that, any kind of expert testimony that we saw in the court in the early days of DNA evidence was usually presented by people, that worked in the laboratories, again, in the Center of Forensic Sciences and the RCMP laboratories. And we really didn't have counsel in Canada that could really contest what it was that they were doing, of what they were presenting, within the courtroom. So in some cases, they would have had to, get an independent expert from the UK, Australia, or the US, which usually cost, a lot of money, and because they didn't really understand DNA evidence, the defense lawyers didn't really understand DNA evidence, they didn't really know how to extract the information within the courtroom, ask the right questions, and I learned that there was a real need for an independent expert, that was not affiliated with the police, or a particular laboratory. So in the early days of my work, even as a master's student, I was asked to help out defense lawyers understand, how DNA works and whether or not I could help them launch defenses for their clients, or what questions to ask, about the actual evidence, which was, enormously interesting. So that, kind of grew my passion, about DNA evidence. There wasn't really anywhere in Canada either where I could really get trained. The RCMP, is doing all the training in Canada. And I have been incredibly fortunate to attend different courses that the RCMP has put on in forensic interviewing, for example, which is the other passion of mine. But I kind of pushed my way into courses in the US. I took DNA statistical courses with the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, where I met many people, that were being trained, for the FBI, and so forth, and other, Canadian officers, detectives, and what have you. So, I had to kind of, figure out how to kind of get that information, on my own. And that led to my PhD, where I tried something unique. Given that we cannot interview jurors in Canada, I decided to set up a mock trial. And I was privileged to get the go-ahead from the Court of Queen's Bench in Calgary to actually have a courtroom. And I actually had a real judge, and I had real experts, DNA experts, and I had real defense lawyers, and I had real Crown prosecutors participating in my so-called mock trial, which was actually a real trial, whereby I changed everything that was identifying about that trial. And we ran this trial in front of a jury, and it was completely scripted. So it was like a massive script that they all played to, and it was video recorded with 7 different cameras. And then after that, I interviewed the jurors, about the evidence. And I learned very quickly, what it was that they were fixated on, within the trial, and one of the major findings that I found was that it almost didn't matter what evidence was part of the trial when the expert would actually come forth and give these statistical numbers, or the probability statistics of, the likelihood that, this DNA belonging to anyone other than the accused is 1 in a trillion. That's really all that they needed to hear. And with that, they would find easily a finding of guilt, on the basis of that, even alone, which is hugely problematic. And then they were fixated on all sorts of other things, which were really, really funny. The clothing of counsel, the hairstyles of counsel.
I've heard that, yeah.
Whether or not, they had access to water, notebooks. At that time when I ran this mock trial, It was not the norm that jurors were granted notebooks with information, so that's changed, since then. But certainly one of the issues that came out of my work was that jurors really needed to be able to ask questions. And I argued in my PhD that really the courtroom is not all that different than, an academic classroom when you have people that are unfamiliar with math, biology, chemistry, physics, anything like that. And they're bombarded with all this kind of information. And they are dissuaded from taking notes, and they're dissuaded from taking notes by counsel, for example, saying things like, look at me, listen to counsel, your job is to pay attention, and that actually ended up being perceived by the jurors as, okay, I'm not really allowed to ask questions. I'm not really allowed to write notes. I'm supposed to watch. Um, um, and then, counsel would say things like, it is my job to ask the questions, not your job, to ask the questions, but for you to listen, and which is, very interesting, and I correlated that with the classroom, this experience in the classroom, students need to be able to ask questions, like, what is this? Like, what is this DNA? Like, how does that work? My jurors had a really difficult time understanding that DNA, can be extracted from anything, in the body. They, in those early days, they thought that blood had to be matched with blood, couldn't really understand, like, how could you extract, DNA from, dental pulp, for example. That was really, really difficult, like, it's like, for them, and difficult for defense lawyers too. They just really were trying at that time to not get those statistical numbers to be presented within the courtroom, because, they learned very quickly that it had way more of an influence than it probably ought to have had.
I can very much see your perspective that a courtroom is much like a classroom because you're asking the jurors to make a decision based on what they're presented, but they have to understand it. So, in essence, they need to learn what's going on. And so, in order to learn, you need to be able to ask questions because if something is unclear to you, you can't critically analyze it to make a decision.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I can totally understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then, those other, issues that, was really apparent, like in me interviewing, lawyers and judges, their perception of, the jury, and this idea that, jurors, they really don't ask good questions. They really shouldn't be allowed to ask questions because they ask ridiculous questions, that are totally irrelevant. But from my standpoint, as as an educator, to me, it scared me to think that we wanted, or the presentation, of a jury that didn't really understand was actually kind of okay, with
Yeah, that is that's more than kind of scary. That's very scary.
yeah, yeah,
That's very scary.
I based on that research, I was like, that there probably is a really good argument for professional jurors, like we see in
Mm,
some countries, very well educated,
right.
jurors on, the issues that, that are at play. Because it's well known that, and that was a really scary part that I learned when I interviewed defense lawyers for my master's, which was all I did for my master's degree, which I completed out of Simon Fraser University, was that if a defense lawyer did not understand the evidence, so the DNA evidence, and the accused had a rap sheet of prior convictions, defense lawyers were more likely to encourage a plea.
Ah,
because they just, were so uncomfortable, with this idea of, having to contest the DNA evidence, which they really
hmm,
didn't understand. Now, the landscape for all of this that we're talking about today, is very different today,
right.
than
Yeah.
it was, at that time. But, the one issue that, remains to this day, and something that we see from time to time, is that we learn that, an expert who provided evidence many, many years ago, might have not completed, all the testing, of the samples, for example, and have, gone into the courtroom just on the basis that they are an expert, so-called expert, and have provided evidence, on their so-called expertise, without really having done, the work. And we saw that, in the case of the the um, the pathologist, Charles Smith, the child pathologist, who in fact, in many of the instances that he had testified in, or in the many cases that he had testified in, he had not actually even, completed all that work. And we had, families whose family members, were convicted of murder of their children, went off to jail, convicted. Their other children ceased, put into foster care, and so forth. And we've then, since learned, that his evidence was in fact incorrect and malicious.
So it's my understanding there's a bit of a process, at least, in the US, to become be considered an expert witness. There's a legal process.
Mhm.
Is there a process in Canada?
Yeah, I mean the courtroom, needs to they kind of conduct an interview, of the individual, that that comes forth, with the evidence, and then they decide whether or not that person should be considered an expert, and they're questioned about their all their work. So, for example, in the case of a pathologist, how many cases have you done, and so forth. But once you are deemed that expert, nobody really questions, anything really about you, which is,
Okay.
problematic, in some of these cases.
So it sounds kind of like with the DNA evidence that pretty much anything presented in court, whether it's an expert witness, whether it's the DNA evidence, some other evidence, it has to always be open to contest, always be open to questions. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, the main question that I always present, and I teach this to my students in my forensics courses too, is that, we still need to answer the question, how did it get there?
Mm,
And we've seen, some interesting ways that, DNA ends up, at certain scenes, whereby, maybe the individual wasn't even there.
mm,
We know that, individuals who are, working the criminal element, are getting more and more sophisticated. One of the issues that we're dealing with, I'm sure it's this way in many jurisdictions, but, a bit of a trend that we've seen, locally, is that, different vehicles, are used, by individuals engaging in criminal activities. And then, shortly thereafter, we find the vehicle burned out. Um, and why does that happen? Well, that is to conceal the evidence. And so, that's problematic for us, of course. Very difficult for us to collect any evidence, in those kinds of, situations, other than we are still able to identify the vehicle. But in many instances, we might not be able to, know the exact color. We might not be able to get the ID, of the actual vehicle, so the people that are, working in the criminal element, as I call it, they're getting, more and more sophisticated. Now there
mm,
is, one part, that's incredibly interesting, and that's, some of the research that I'm working on currently, is, the evidence that we end up collecting from, for example, CCTV, and security cameras. It is becoming, increasingly more difficult to get away, with get away with not being seen. Because of these kinds of these kinds of cameras, just about everywhere, and so the work that I'm working on right now, which is interesting, is I look at the evidence that we're able to collect, which is, fairly secure evidence. We can play that in court, and that works beautifully in many instances, whereby we don't actually really need a very tough interrogation in many instances. In many instances, we are now, and I've seen this, through, some of the training that I've done with the RCMP, we can just play back, the video in front of the alleged accused, and observe their reaction to that actual video. It's like, here you go. Like, can you explain to us, what's going on in this video? And oftentimes, the individual is like, oh, shoot, that is clearly me. Now I'm going to have to, figure out, some sort of an explanation as to what's going on in the picture, which is difficult to explain away if you see someone, pointing a gun, you see the gun, and you see, clearly the individual, so that has an advantage in the collection of evidence for example, the police. The same goes for, some of the cases that we see at the OCME, where we have an individual, that died, by falling in front of a train. We have CCTV, be able to see, did that individual get pushed, from the platform into the train, or did they jump? So that's very, very good evidence. Now, the other piece that I'm working on right now, and that is something that I have invited Alisa, who was one of the students at the OCME, to partake in, is what happens to the responders, the collectors of the evidence, the people that are looking at the video. What happens to them? How does it impact them emotionally? Like the vicarious trauma.
Ooh, that's big.
So
Yeah.
you are watching these live events, and it creates the sense of helplessness. And you can imagine, and we see that that evidence sometimes could be something, and I'm not talking about, a specific case, because I can't talk about a specific case, but, you can only imagine, a person, who is actively dying from a fentanyl overdose. There's cameras, behind a building, let's say at, anywhere in Calgary, anywhere. And people walk by, and you can see on the video, people are walking by, nobody's tapping this person. Then you see them ceasing, and then they die, and then you watch this, you have this, incredible sense of, why isn't anybody helping? Why isn't anybody stopping? Stop, and get a kit, or call, 911, to save this person, or, a suicide, an active suicide, right? Where you can actually see the face of the individual contemplating, should I kill myself or shouldn't I kill myself? And then it's on video, they do this, so the evidence is really great. The impact on those that have to watch it, is horrific. The other thing that I worry about is social media getting getting hold, of anything that's live.
Oh, yeah.
And that being shared, right? You've seen many, many instances or cases, where there's misinformation in criminal cases, and once that information, has been shared on multiple platforms, it can end up really, hurting families. And we saw that in the case of the mom and daughter that was murdered, in Calgary, a number of years ago. Sarah Bailey and her 5-year-old daughter, Talia Marksman. I don't know if you remember in the early days, there was some suggestion that Sarah Bailey, was working in the sex trade. And, so that, was shown on Twitter, that information, was on Facebook. And then we learned, later on that the likelihood or the reason or the rationale behind her murder seemed to have been more linked to her trying to help a friend getting out of the sex trade.
I did hear that. Yes.
Which is a very, very different story. And then
very different.
And then her family, is trying to clear her name, and trying to explain, to the media, to people, that, this was not, the case at all, which is hugely damaging.
It's very interesting how easily we can condemn somebody by just that one presumption. She's working in the sex trade. Well, she must be guilty of everything then.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it flips 180. No. She was actually helping somebody trying to get out of the sex trade. And that's why she was killed. Oh, that changes everything. So yeah, it really brings to light our own biases and how we can be so easily influenced by so little on social media or anything really, and it's all just gossip.
Yeah. I mean, there's that, but, so my main research focus now is, still, on forensics. I'm still following, all the changes to DNA evidence. We're seeing now that, there's a lot more work related to touch DNA, how much DNA we leave behind. And there's a lot more work, in the area of producing, technology that can read DNA very, very quickly, so that, in the future, and that is, actually happening in some places in the world where we can bring the equipment to, the crime scene, or, a natural disaster, and identify, samples, very, very quickly, so that's very interesting. But I'm also hugely interested, in all the other technologies, that we are using, and relying on, like CCTV, and cell phone towers, have really changed the landscape too, and was a big part of the Sarah Bailey trial, as well, because we were able to find that the perpetrator's cell phone had been, in all these different places, by linking, the pings, and so forth, so in that trial, it was very much about, well, can you explain to us how your cell phone was here, how your cell phone was there, and all that kind of thing, so yeah.
And from what I understand too, the accuracy is getting better and better, especially with cell phone locations.
Yes.
Yeah. Because from what I understood, even 5 years ago, it wasn't great. The triangulation was so. Being able to actually place somebody at a specific location at a specific time wasn't quite possible. I mean, it was almost there, but we're getting pretty close now, from what I understand.
Yeah. It's very good. It's very good. But then we're still dealing, with the people, that are trying to outsmart, the evidence. And we've got burner phones, right? Like burner phones,
Yeah.
we end up, apprehending somebody, and they're in a possession of like 40 phones, right? So every time they,
Right.
make a phone call, they get rid of it, right? So, so we still have to find ways,
Right.
and that takes a lot of money, a lot of resources. But it's clear, that we have a lot of work to do. There's a huge need. Just thinking about, the loss of life in Lahaina in Hawaii, the identification, of all those people, right? We lack resources in many parts, of the world. My understanding is that at the OCME and or the coroner's office in Lahaina, like they have no capacity to identify, all of those individuals. And I just, read this morning that they have enlisted help of forensic experts, who sifted through evidence on the site of 9/11. So it's massive amount of work, and sadly, just like which was the case, with 9/11 too. Some of those bodies will never be found.
Yeah, yeah, that's the thing with those disasters, is that nobody is prepared for it, but they seem to be happening more and more. And there, yeah, there needs to be resources out there that we can call upon. I recently read a book called Personal Effects, and he was he runs a company that specializes. Oh, Robert Jensen. There we go. Robert Jensen. The book is Personal Effects, and he runs a company that specializes in going in and helping with these disasters, whether they be natural or man-made, and just helping to coordinate and sort through and deal with everything, from identification of the people to what happened, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to figure that out. Because yeah, they're huge undertakings, and it's just utter chaos until you can try to get a handle on things.
Well, and that's, that's one of the reasons that, I wanted to establish this, partnership, with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, because our program, Justice Studies, really didn't have, initially a forensic focus. Um, and certainly our students did not have a lot of exposure to death investigation as a result. And that I'm not, meaning that every criminal justice program needs to be focusing on death investigation. We are an academic institution, but if we can bridge, that experience, for the student, the exposure, for the student, I think that's a win-win, and the OCME in Calgary, finds our students incredibly valuable, to them, and time again, well, not we've had, 3 or 4 of them, hired, coming out of our degree program, which is, unheard of, students coming out with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, and then they end up working, as death investigators and autopsy technicians, full time. That's something, that I'm hugely invested in, hugely proud of, and the students that get that opportunity, I'm so proud of them, and the relationship that I'm able to establish with them, is a real, bonded relationship. I follow them wholeheartedly, and I'm immensely proud of them. It's such a win-win situation, all around. But it does come with, that trepidation, I guess, of what are these students being exposed to? Can they handle, what it is that, they're actually, seeing? Because this is real life. This is real death. Like they see the worst of Southern Alberta, the majority of cases that the average person, south of Alberta knows nothing about, right?
And death in Western society is not, it's something very excluded from everyday life.
Yeah, it's very, very uncomfortable, right?
Yeah, it's not kind of part of our culture. It used to be that the dead stayed within our homes. we would invite people over and, have them look at the body, celebrate their life, transition them over to the next plane into death. There was all these rituals and day long celebrations, day long routines that we used to do, and we don't do that anymore. It's
Hmm.
now, when somebody dies, they're taken away, they're behind another wall, they're put in a coffin, they're, put in the ground. They're just taken away. And so we don't even have exposure to that anymore. Once somebody dies, they're taken away from us. And so to be around death, that is very, very different. It's not within our culture at all.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, you're right. You're right. And the research I have been doing, in interviewing everybody kind of that was willing to participate, that work, in that environment, it's, there's lots of issues, related to exactly what you're talking about, that makes it difficult for them to do their job too. Like, for example, one of the findings that I've found, in the interviews is, how infrequent people are prepared, when someone dies, and the implication for an office like the Office of Chief Medical Examiner is that that often means that the body cannot be released to a funeral home, right away, because, there's no preparation. We've got, issues where, the families are split, or there's infighting within the family as to, what was the actual, what was the wishes, or the wishes of the individual who had died. Nobody's had that discussion. Nobody knows, so this person in the family thinks, it should be cremation. This person in the family thinks it should be burial. It should be a white coffin. It should be, like all of these things. But that, while all that goes on, outside of the office, that means that, there is a body, decedent that, is not being removed, and they're bursting at the seams. That office is an old office, the one in Calgary, and it certainly was not, what do you call it, built, to house the amount of people that, that are, going through there. Um,
Right.
So seeing that and learning that, and certainly, the overdoses too, right? Like, there's like way
Yeah.
more of that than we talk about, in the media, and create, awareness, about, and so forth. And it affects, um, you know, all families.
Hmm.
you know
Yeah.
so but the exposure, that my students have to that experience is invaluable. They have.
Well, what do you so because it's not mandatory, it's voluntary,
Mhm.
the practicum at the OCME. Um, so how many students do you think have gone through the practicum now? Because you've been running it for a few years now.
Yeah, I think we're in year 7, so I
Okay.
would say 12.
12? Okay. Do
um
you see that there's kind of a pattern in those people that come up to you and are at least interested in doing the program, and then those that actually go through with it?
Well, it's very competitive, right?
Oh, it is?
So,
Okay.
so meaning that, Leanne Atchison, in our department, the practicum coordinator, and I will interview, for that position. So there's only one student that goes through every 4 months.
Okay.
So that is the most 3 a year.
Okay.
During COVID, we did not have a student down there. For obvious reasons. Um, so it's very competitive, and we do, complete interviewing process, multiple interviews, where we, really kind of, dig at the student, inform the student, this is what you're going to see. How are you going to handle that? What are your support systems? How are you going to handle that? The fact that you are, privy to all of this information that nobody knows anything about, and you cannot talk about it. you're exposed to, the evidence of criminal cases that will not go before the courts for, maybe a year. And you might never even see the true outcome, of that case. And you have to close your mouth and not share, that information with anybody. So our fear, of course, is always, that we don't have a student with integrity, maturity, who just really thinks that this is cool. So, and just, want to be able to tell their friends, that they have the coolest practicum. So we have to kind of, weed through all that, vet through that, and so far, knock on wood, we've been very successful with that. We do pick students that we consider to be of high caliber. And I'm fortunate to teach them, so I teach them in year 2 and I teach them in year 4. And I tell my students in year 2, that I keep track, of when they hand in assignments, how they engage in my classes, in year 2, and their pattern, throughout their degree, their tardiness, their excuses, their communication, their writing skills, all of that kind of stuff. So sometimes students don't get an opportunity to even interview because we're like, no,
Right.
it's not going to happen.
So that's kind of the pre-existing stuff. What do you offer in terms of supports when they're going through this? Because they may, be of high caliber, they're an engaged student, they've kind of met your standards going into it. But, because we aren't exposed to death that much, especially that much death in such close proximity, that's it's an intense situation to be in a practicum at the OCME's office. And so what kind of supports do you offer during the practicum that can help either train them or help them deal with the stuff that they're seeing, with the
Oh,
confidentiality they're having to keep?
well, it's a process, the very first day that they end up attending, and usually it's 3 days a week, that they go, and most of the students go Monday, Wednesday, Friday, something like that, so there's a bit of a break. But, I'm with them, and we attend together, and I, based on their body language, we'll talk, with them, throughout that day. It's not like we jump in to the autopsy suite, watch, bodies, that are open, and so forth, like right off the bat, we do a lot of talking. There's a smell that's at the office, is, something that it's very difficult to get used to. We go outside, we take breaks, and in that first, little bit, the start of the practicum, they're not really touching anything, they're learning. The beautiful thing is that they're allowed to ask all the questions in the world. All the questions, are answered, some of which I are able to, answer, and we work through it. And then everybody that works in the office, now that I have past students there, they know what the student's going through, so that's peer support, that is invaluable, is something that we've now established, this far into the practicum. They're encouraged to keep a diary of a sort. I've always said, before you get in your car, or when you're in your car, before you leave, write down, what you need to kind of get off your chest. And then reach out to me, let's talk. We talk often. We talk on the phone. We talk late at night. We talk anytime during the day. I'm totally available, via text. The students just text me, can we talk? And we talk. And we talk through, how difficult it is to see what they see, the shock, and seeing someone dead that's their age, the shock of seeing someone who's committed suicide that's their age, someone that's their age, that's died in a motorcycle crash, that's died, in a vehicle, accident, and so forth. Like those are really difficult. The first time they see a child, death, the first time they see a baby versus, a 5-year-old, baby drowning, and there's the first and the first, right? And some of my students have the worst day ever on the very first day. We can't predict that. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, like it can be a homicide on the first day, and then a baby death, and then, a suicide, and then, a fentanyl overdose, and then a fire, and then, someone falling off a mountain, and then a plane crash. It's like, whoa, right? And
That's
then
a lot. That's a lot.
it's a lot, and remember that, all deaths go through that office, from Red Deer, down to the border, and it's any accident, any accidental death, any homicide, any child death. All child deaths are considered unnatural. Unless, of course, the child is, under terminal care, in a hospital, something like that. You know, fire victims, you name it, right? So,
Yeah.
it's a lot, but we work through it. And by the end of it, they, have figured out a really good way to process it. Some of them are absolutely hooked. This is what they want to do. They can't think of anything better, whereas, some of them are like, the experience was invaluable, but I think that my skill set is better served as a police officer, as a messenger to people that are still living, which is perfect. I've done my job. I think, when I teach death investigation in my forensics course, and I show, an autopsy, in that course, it's not mandatory for the students to stay. And I have students that, as soon as they hear, the drills, the tools that are used in the autopsy, they don't, all of a sudden feel so well, and they get up and leave perfectly fine. And then
That's not for everybody.
that's not for everybody. And then I have other students that's like, whoa, like that is so interesting. That's quite the puzzle, and
Yeah.
I want
Yeah.
more, of that. So, it's a process. It continues to be a process. But there are, support in place, through the university. We've got counseling services too. And I highly recommend that, encourage that. But, a lot of it is really just talking through, what it is, making sense of it, taking a step away, using their voices. It's like, no, I'm not ready to see that.
Right.
I've had students that are like, no, I've got a child of my own. I can't see this today. And that is fine. I've had students learn how to sew bodies, weigh organs, take samples, and that's a process. It's
Right.
not first day. It's probably not even first week. I've had a few of them that's like, whoo, this is like great, and they become, the best sewers, ever, and that's great. But it's a process, and I never compare one student to a past student either.
Right. They're very much individuals
They're all
on
my
their
stars.
individual journeys.
They're all
Yeah.
my stars. They're all my stars. It takes a lot of courage to expose yourself to that willfully, because the picture that you see in your head is a really tough photograph or video or playback to get rid of. Once you see it, once you smell it,
Yeah.
it can be, a permanent, imprint.
Oh, yeah. Especially that smell. I will never forget that smell. I can't describe it, but I can never forget it.
Yeah, it's yeah. I've tried, you know, putting, what do you call that?
The Vicks?
Yeah, the Vicks. That doesn't help. Multiple showers with shampoo into my
Yeah.
nostrils. Yeah.
No, it's in your nose. It's staying for days. That's it.
I mean, the students are masked, right?
Right.
Big learning curve with COVID too, right? There are still individuals that will end up at the OCME that may have COVID even today,
boy.
so exposure and stuff,
Right.
is a real thing, and learning how to breathe through that mask, for that amount of time, can make you really, really lightheaded too, right? So,
Right.
going outside is really important, grounding your feet and sitting down, and eating and drinking, and all that kind of stuff, So I think that we do a good job at looking after the student, but it's not for everybody. And should the student wish to stop that practicum, we take them out immediately. Yes, and we tell them that they do not have to stick it out, and it's not that they are, to be considered, of a weak character because they are uncomfortable with that situation.
Right.
Not at all.
Right.
And that's why, us deciding on who is the next student for that position is a long process.
Right. Right. So we're almost out of time.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see the program continuing? Do you see the program expanding? Do you see the program changing in any way?
We will continue as long as we are welcome. We are limited by the size of the space. I mean, I'm sure that they would happily take five students, but there really is not, the physical space. As it is, now it's like, you're moving around, trying to stay, out of the way, so that they can do, the really important work. So, I hope that we can continue for a really long time. There has been some talks about a new building, but that decision rests with the justice minister and whoever provides that kind of money. I think that government officials should go and visit the space and see what is actually going on down there, to really get a full understanding of how important that work is. And that's what ultimately my research goal is to try and take this research and share it with the general public, how important this work is, how, the dignity, of the individuals that work there, how much pride they have in their work, and how little they're recognized, for that work. It's everybody's worst day to have to go and visit, that office. A family member being brought in there is everybody's, worst day. But the work that they do down there is like, it's so important. And I'm hugely proud of the work, that they do at that office, and my students, of course.
Right. All right. Well, just as we close, what is the name of the program in which you teach at Mount Royal University?
I teach in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies.
Sweet. So if interested
It's
students
in the
were
Faculty of Arts.
Faculty of Arts. So if anybody listening to this episode is interested in getting into the program, that's where they can find you.
Yes.
Fabulous. All right. Thank you very much.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.